work by your mind is going along path A, and then at the punchline you suddenly have to switch to path B. Here's a really short joke. Mae West, 1935, one of my favorite American comedians. Mae West said, marriage is a wonderful institution, but I'm not ready for an institution. So notice what she does. She switches the meaning at the last word. So people who can see things one way and then suddenly see them a different way typically have a better sense of humor. People who are rigid-minded, authoritarian types like Hitler, who can only see things one way, typically don't have as good a sense of humor. Here's a couple. These aren't funny. This is just seeing things. What's that?
I see.
So it's a duck or is it a duck or a rabbit? And the answer is yes. Here's another one someone recently sent me. The rabbit is running as fast as you can imagine to the right. If you want to see the duck, you have to tip your head over onto your right shoulder. You get the idea.
Oh, yes, I just,
Did you get it?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Which way is this plane flying? Away from you or toward you?
Toward us.
The answer is yes. If you're on the ground, looking up, it's flying which way?
Oh.
Toward you. If you're above it in another plane, I hope you're in another plane. Excuse me, if you're on the ground, it's flying away from you. If you're above it, it's flying away. So these are examples of seeing things one way and then seeing them another way. And humor very often is based on that phenomenon. Here it is in words. Dr. Joel Goodman of the Humor Project in Saratoga Springs, New York, lent me this one. Somebody want to read this for me? It can be read at least two ways. Somebody want to take a chance?
Woman without her man is nothing.
Okay.
Woman without her man is nothing.
That's
Is that the same?
Yeah.
Somebody read it a different way. Can somebody read it a different way? Just one way to read this? Yeah.
Woman without her man is nothing?
Yeah, country and western song. Woman without her man is nothing. Notice those are, they're not actually opposite, but they're pretty close. So if you're mentally flexible, if you can shift around, all kinds of things become possible. All right. If you want to increase your mental flexibility and your sense of humor, this is a plug for Bob Mankoff's cartoon caption contest. Every week in New Yorker, the last page is a cartoon like this, but it doesn't have a caption. So you got to send yours in, and if you win, it's pretty tough because the competition is stiff. There are 3 books out now on how to win the cartoon caption contest. I submitted for many months and never won anything. This one, the winner was, actually you started it, Madge. My submission was, honey, have you seen the remote? I thought mine was better. Of course, that's because I wrote it. Okay, anyway, I want to move on now, and I want to talk about humor in American history. I've talked about leadership, and now I want to talk about some of our country's leaders. American history started off, as far as humor goes, on a wrong foot. It started off in the 1600s, and especially in New England, the culture was almost without humor. In fact, humor was actively suppressed because this culture was controlled by a religious group. What was the religious group that controlled New England in the 1600s?
Puritans.
The Puritans. And the Puritans were influenced very heavily by the theology of John Calvin. And I'm going to give some quotes from Calvin. And in this philosophical system, this religious system, play had almost no room. They had almost no tolerance for play. And because of that, humor is a kind of play, they suppressed humor. A couple of examples. Robert Barclay, one of their theologians. Seeing the chief end of all religion is to redeem men from the spirit and vain conversation of this world, and to lead to inward communion with God, before whom, if we fear always, we are accounted happy. Therefore, all the vain customs and habits thereof, both in word and deed, are to be rejected and forsaken by those who come to this fear. Boy, these guys could write sentences. Such as the unprofitable plays, frivolous recreations, sportings, and gamings, which are invented to pass away the precious time and divert the mind from the witness of God in the heart, and from the living sense of this fear, and from that evangelical spirit wherewith Christians ought to be leavened, and which leads into sobriety, gravity, and godly fear. It is not lawful to use games, sports, plays, nor among other things comedies among Christians. I won't even finish this because I'm running out of breath here. The theology here, as I said, comes from John Calvin. And John Calvin's basic message was this. All human beings are born depraved and deserving of hell. Now, some are saved, but it's not through any effort or value of theirs. It all comes from God's side. Here's Calvin. We derive an innate depravity from our very birth. Every descendant from the impure source is born infected with the contagion of sin. And even before we behold the light of life, we are in the sight of God defiled and polluted. From a putrefied root has sprung putrid branches. There was in Adam such a spring of corruption that it transfused from parents to children in a perpetual stream. So the whole human race is utterly worthless. Here's a drawing, not a drawing, but a little sculpture that I dug up on the internet. If you think of babies this way, and you think of the human race this way, you're not going to have the basic optimism, and you're certainly not going to have the sense of joyfulness and surprise that is required for a sense of humor. So the Puritans, no surprise, when they came to control England in the mid-1600s, outlawed comedy. On this side of the Atlantic, they outlawed Christmas. From 1659 to 1681, it was illegal to celebrate Christmas in Boston. So this is the kind of, well, you get the picture, pretty dark. Now, things pick up in the 1700s. In the 1700s, lots more religions came to the fore in the colonies, in the English colonies. And lots more kinds of immigrants. People came from different areas of Europe and from other places. And diversity is one of the things that gets humor going. Another thing that gets humor going is conflict, especially political conflict. You take any country in the world where there is political conflict. Right now I'm doing some studies about Egypt. You automatically get humor. In the colonies, before 1750, there were over 500 satires in print. And most of these were aimed, of course, at the British king. The basic way to get a satire is to take some shortcoming, some fault, some mistake, some bad feature of somebody, especially a leader, and exaggerate it. So I want to give you some of the ones that were very popular in the colonies. This is King George. The way that they portrayed him, they always gave him this huge gut, and they usually, here, I think that's a cigar, they usually had him sitting near a plate of food that he had eaten. This one is called Temperance, Enjoying a Frugal Meal. So he's got a couple pounds, or are those cruets? I don't know. And he's got food. They also made fun of his wife, because if you're going to make fun of the king, you're also going to make fun of the queen. Here is one mocking the king as being what was called an anti-saccharite. Saccharite is from the word saccharin for sugar, and an anti-saccharite was somebody who did not partake of sugar as a way of protesting the slave trade in the Caribbean. So here they're making fun of the king and the queen, and I'm not going to read you all the text, but you get the basic idea. The leader was seen as corrupt. He was seen as an elitist. He was seen as somebody who valued his own comfort. And when the revolution finally comes in the 1760s and then in the 1770s, the king has been mocked hundreds and hundreds of times in print. When the revolution finally came, this was one of the popular cartoons at the time. The horse is America, and the king is the rider. So the revolution is the king being thrown from his horse. Now, the big medium that carried all this stuff was the newspaper. And the newspapers were utterly essential to the American Revolution. And it's no surprise then that the best-known humorist of the colonial period was a newspaper publisher. You may have heard of him. He did the Pennsylvania Gazette. And Ben Franklin did one of the very first cartoons. This was also in this morning's proceedings. One of the very first political cartoons in the country, 1754, he did this cartoon. There was a legend that if you cut a snake into pieces, if you can put the pieces back together by sundown, the thing will grow back and will be fine. So this, based on this legend, Franklin, each one of these sections of snake obviously involves one of the colonies. Now, Franklin was not just funny in print, but he was also funny in words. One of the most famous stories about Franklin, and you probably know it, was in the 1750s at the Albany Convention. John Hancock got up and said, gentlemen, he said, we must be unanimous. There must be no pulling in different directions. We must hang together. Ben Franklin then very famously said, Yes, we must all hang together, or most assuredly, we will all hang separately. One of the best things about Benjamin Franklin was that he had a sense of humor, especially about himself. And as I said, Barack Obama is an indication, I'm going to give some more indications, people like John Kennedy. But with his sense of humor, he could look at himself from the outside. He could look at himself the way other people looked at him. In the Pennsylvania Gazette, for example, he had a story one time. He went down to the dock to meet somebody who was coming in on an ocean ship, and there was a big barrel of tar. And as Franklin tried to get past the barrel of tar, somehow it came apart and it went all over all of his clothes. And this could be, if this were William Howard Taft, you never would have heard about this. But for Franklin, it became a funny piece in the next day's paper. Franklin was also a practical joker. Franklin, as you know, developed stuff with electricity, and he became fairly famous for this. People would come to his house and they'd want to see his experiments with electricity and stuff. Franklin finally just got tired of this. So he had an iron fence around his house, and where people were really pissing him off, he would hook up his electrical generator to the fence, and people would be leaning on the fence and they'd suddenly get a shock and go away. So this was Ben Franklin's sense of humor in action. Franklin showed a new kind of humor which became very popular in the 1800s. And the most famous person in the 1800s who took on the Franklin legacy, I think, was Mark Twain. It was a mix of practicality and wit and common sense, and most of all, distrust of authority. So challenging authority was a big part of all of this stuff. All right. Let me move on to the middle of the century, and actually a little bit later than the middle, with the most famous cartoonist of the 19th century, and this was Thomas Nast. Nast was the guy who invented the elephant for the Republicans and the donkey for the Democrats. This is a cartoon about Tammany Hall. If you know American history, Tammany Hall was a really corrupt form of city government in New York City. And who's to blame for all the trouble? And you can see what it is. It's a circle of people, all of whom are pointing to somebody else. Okay, so in the 20th century, political cartooning really takes off. 19th century, you get some very big stars, but in the 20th century, you start getting dozens and dozens. So I'm just going to go quickly through some cartoons from the 20th century. 1929, of course, was the famous stock market crash, and this is a cartoon from the New Yorker at that time. After you, Peister, you're the senior partner. These cartoons were so widespread that a lot of people to this day believe that during the years 1929 to say 1939, lots of people jumped off buildings on Wall Street. That's not true. The suicide rate in New York was no higher during the Depression, at least from tall buildings. But these images, these cartoons were powerful. When Hitler came to power, there were lots of cartoons about him, much to his dismay. Here's one. Hitler is speaking in front of the whole assembled government. I think I may say, without fear of contradiction, you get the idea here. In the 1950s and into the 1960s, the leader of the Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev was very famous for what he did at the United Nations, which was pound his shoe on the desk. And this is a cartoon making fun of him. Notice the sock and that kind of mangled up foot. In the 1970s, there were lots of cartoons surrounding Watergate. And here's one of Richard Nixon and John Mitchell, who was Attorney General. And Nixon is saying to Mitchell, "Oh, nothing much. What's new with you, John?" And you can see what's happening here. The war's going on. Okay. In 1976, we had a new president, a Democratic president named Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter was smart in a lot of ways, but in some ways he was really horribly stupid. One thing that he did before his election was he did an interview with Playboy magazine in which he told the truth. And one of the things he said in that interview was that he's frequently lusted after women. He didn't say that he had adulterous relationships, but he said he frequently lusted after women. So here's a cartoon from the time. Jimmy Carter down in the little way. Okay. Now, if I had more time, I'd love to go through Tom Tolles and a whole bunch of political cartoonists, but I don't have time. But I just want to close with where I started, which is making fun of British monarchy. Here's one of my favorite cartoons where Americans make fun of the British monarch.
Any British person.
Right, yeah. Now, most American presidents have not been gifted with great senses of humor, but there have been a couple of exceptions. But to me, the guy who's at the top is Abraham Lincoln, and the recent movie brought out a little bit of this, but not very much. And here's a book, if you want to look up any of this stuff. Lincoln Laughing, the stories, jokes, and anecdotes of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln used humor for a whole bunch of reasons. One was as a social lubricant. Another was to reduce stress. I mean, what could be more stressful than the Civil War? It's hard to imagine anything more stressful. Lincoln was roundly criticized through his whole 1 point, whatever it was, terms for his sense of humor. And he used to use it at cabinet meetings. Here is an account from the diary of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. This was not in the movie, Spielberg's movie. Stanton wrote that before Lincoln announced the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, quote, Mr. Lincoln was reading a book of some kind, which seemed to amuse him. It was a little book. He finally turned to us and said, gentlemen, did you ever read anything from Artemus Ward? Let me read you a chapter that's very funny. Not a member of the cabinet smiled. As for myself, I was angry, and I looked to see what the president meant. It seemed to me like buffoonery. He, however, continued to read the chapter from Artemus Ward, which he did with great deliberation, and finishing, he laughed heartily. But not one of us joined in his laughter. Well, he said, let's have another chapter. And he read another chapter to our total astonishment. I was considering whether I should rise and leave the meeting abruptly when he threw the book down. He heaved a big sigh, and he said, gentlemen, why don't you laugh? With a fearful strain that is upon me night and day, if I did not laugh, I should die. And you need this medicine as much as I do. Lincoln also used humor in very clever ways during the Lincoln-Douglas debates before he became president. For example, he was doing a lot of fancy footwork and sliding back and forth in the argument. And Stephen Douglas was smart. And Stephen Douglas said, Mr. Lincoln is being two-faced. Lincoln's response was very quick. He said, ladies and gentlemen, I leave it to you. If I had two faces, would I be wearing this one? Now that's evasive, it's irresponsible, but rhetorically, it's pretty damn good. Okay? There's even a story about Lincoln, and I haven't been able to confirm this, that Lincoln saved his own life in the 1850s when he was challenged to a duel. This is how guys settled problems in the 1850s. Lincoln was challenged to a duel by a gentleman from Virginia. And Lincoln said, I accept your challenge, sir, if I can specify the weapons we use and the distance at which we stand. The gentleman from Virginia agreed. Lincoln said, cow shit at 5 paces. That was the end of the fight. So, this is a guy who is mentally flexible, who can see things from multiple perspectives. All right, let me add one president here that's on almost nobody's list for being funny, but he was so quirky that I find it funny. And his name is Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was nicknamed Silent Cal because he almost said nothing for most of the time he was president. Whoops, let me go back to Calvin Coolidge. He was often ridiculed, as I said, as Silent Cal. Will Rogers from Oklahoma, the great comedian. Will Rogers was invited to the White House, and Mr. and Mrs. Rogers went, and they met the president and his wife. And as he was sitting down to dinner, Rogers turned to Coolidge and he said, sorry, I didn't catch your name. Calvin Coolidge did so little that when he died, Dorothy Parker was at the New Yorker in New York City. And somebody rushed in and said, President Coolidge is dead. And Dorothy Parker said, how can they tell? Which I just knock out. Coolidge had his own sense of humor, however. On the 1924 campaign for re-election, he held a press conference, and somebody said, do you have any statement on the campaign? And Coolidge said, no. Another reporter said, can you tell us something about the world situation? Lots of problems in Germany, for example. He said, no. A third reporter said, any information on prohibition? And Coolidge said, no. He said, and then the reporter started to leave the room. He said, but don't quote me. Coolidge also, like Benjamin Franklin, liked practical jokes. And in 1923, in the White House, they had installed a whole bunch of buzzers and lights. So he could call, by pressing these little buttons on his desk, he could call people from the kitchen and people from downstairs and people who had the car and stuff. And every once in a while, just for fun, Coolidge would press all the buttons at the same time, and then he'd hide behind the door. This is the President of the United States, screwing around. The president who got the most credit, and I think right up there with Lincoln, was John Kennedy. And John Kennedy was amazingly quick-witted. This is John Kennedy with Harold Macmillan, Prime Minister of England. And I think the best humor of Kennedy's was when he made fun of himself. He did this almost once a week. There's a lot of books about Kennedy's humor. His ability to just turn the tables on himself, and not even self-deprecating humor, but just wistful, thoughtful humor. Kennedy one time was asked to say hello to these high school kids who were just coming to the White House. This is the President of the United States. This is the middle, around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But Kennedy said, yeah, I'll say something to them. And when he saw all these fresh young faces and these kids who've got their whole lives ahead of them and they're having a nice summer, Kennedy, some of these kids, in fact, had jobs as pages, and they were just had summer positions there. That's why they went to the White House. Kennedy looked at him and he said, gee, I wish I just had a summer job here. Another time, Kennedy had a tour of people coming through, and a 10-year-old boy raised his hand and said, Mr. President, how did you become a war hero? And Kennedy said it was completely involuntary. He said, they sank my boat. That is irreplaceable. You can't create better rapport than to use that kind of humor. He also used it the way Kennedy used it, excuse me, the way that Lincoln used it, to deflect criticism. Now, people have criticized this, and I think that's right, but Kennedy was really good at it. If you know anything about the 1960 election, most of Kennedy's money came from his daddy, and Joseph Kennedy was hated on Wall Street for taking advantage of other stockbrokers in the 1930s stock crash. So Kennedy's father's money was a huge bone of contention for a lot of people. Kennedy was at a fundraiser, and he knew that the press was there, so he decided he was going to just pop the balloon of this issue. And Kennedy had a piece of paper. This is all fiction, of course, but Kennedy said, I just got this telegram from my very generous daddy. It says, Dear Jack, don't buy a single vote more than is necessary. I'll be damned if I pay for a landslide. That is, you just can't do better than that. Another president who used humor to deflect criticism was this gentleman, Ronald Reagan. I know the guy who was Ronald Reagan's speech coach. Not his speech coach, but his debate coach. And I know the guy who wrote this joke for Reagan. Reagan was an actor, so he could deliver lines. In the first debate between Reagan and Mondale in 1984, Reagan lost his place a couple of times. It looked like maybe he had early Alzheimer's, which he did. So when he's going up for the next presidential debate with Walter Mondale, he's got to respond to the criticism, which a lot of people have. He's the oldest candidate running for office, and maybe he's too old. So Reagan was really good at timing, and he just waited for a question about his age. And when that question came up, here's what Reagan said. I will not make age an issue in this campaign. I'm not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience. So just touche. He just completely reversed it. All right. So with all of this stuff, we get a picture of humor and its relationship to leadership. And some leaders use it well, some leaders use it poorly. The last thing I want to talk about, and then we can open it up to discussion, is ridicule. And ridicule is something that I think many people have misunderstood, because many people treat ridicule as if it were equivalent to serious criticism. And I think humor adds a dimension to criticism that makes it quite a different thing. So I want to give you kind of a quick theory of ridicule. To ridicule somebody, I suggest, is to represent that person to an audience in such a way that the audience finds them funny. So, to ridicule somebody is to hold them up to laughter. If we use the incongruity theory of humor, then to make somebody seem funny, we make them look incongruous. We especially make them look like they have some physical fault, or they have some intellectual fault, or some moral fault. So some ways to ridicule somebody. Make them look like they've got ugly features, or they're obese, or they're clumsy, or intellectual shortcomings. They're not very bright. They don't know what's what with a certain issue. Or they have moral faults. They're drunk, or lying, or adulterous, or hypocrites, or whatever. So these are some of the basic ways to ridicule somebody. Now, the standard way to make some shortcoming funny is to simply stretch it. Simply make it look worse than it actually is. And that's been used since the days of the ancient Greeks. The people who invented comedy, after all, about 2,500 years ago, were the people of Athens. And Aristophanes is the most famous comedy writer. And Aristotle, one of the great philosophers, wrote a whole book about this, about what comedy was, called the Poetics. The chapter on comedy is missing, but the intro is there. And the basic idea of making somebody look funny is to take something that's wrong with them and stretch it. What I'd like to close with is an example from the 2008 campaign, where it was John McCain versus Barack Obama. McCain at this time had quite a bit of support. In fact, here in Arizona, I know he had a lot of support. But one of the things that the satirical publication and online service, The Onion, did was they picked up on his crotchetiness, his grumpiness, his seeming irritability, and they created a new character. Now, if I can get this up, I'm going to skip this stuff. The character that they created was called Jode Cressbeckler. If you ever want to look this up, just type in Onion, Jode Cressbeckler. So let me close this out and see if I can get. Where do I search?
Just the top, just the bar right there. Just click on it.
Oh, click in there? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it'll search for you automatically.
Okay. So I'm going to do Onion, Jode Cressbeckler, and I want to use.
Hit on the microscope.
Yeah, I've got to use some keywords to get me the right one. I want old, grizzled. And that should do it. Old and grizzled should do it. I hope the sound is on.
Maybe just enter
Oh, yeah. Perfect. Here's the idea. Kane has got competition from the right. Okay? And Jode Cressbeckler is that competition.
He's getting sound.
Okay. Here we go. Oh, there it is. Now I can skip it.
John McCain is facing new competition on the campaign trail. Jane Carmichael has details of the War for the White House election analysis bunker. Jane?
Thank you, Andrea. A new third-party presidential candidate is cutting into John McCain's base of support, attracting voters who feel McCain is not grizzled and ornery enough.
Washington drowned in snake oil salesman, and I'm going to run him out.
Joe Cressbeckler, an independent from the Black Hills, officially entered the race for the White House this morning. GOP officials are worried Cressbeckler could play a spoiler role similar to Ralph Nader in 2000.
I got a tax plan for you.
Conservative Republican voters, 33% said they supported McCain because he was the most cantankerous, disagreeable candidate on the ballot. Now, Cressbeckler gives them an even more irascible option.
I like him. He's mad all the time.
McCain is old. Is he old enough?
I'm very funny. I can imagine drowning without gas.
Now, while McCain says he would refuse to speak to leaders of foreign nations opposing the U.S., Cressbeckler has refused to ever speak to a foreigner in his life. He sports a wooden leg from his service in the Spanish-American War. And while McCain has spent the last 20 years in Washington, Cressbeckler has been living in a mountain shack with no hot water or indoor plumbing, making him a true Beltway outsider.
Now, Jane, realistically, does Joe Cressbeckler have a chance at the White House here?
Well, no, but he's connecting strongly with the conservative base voters McCain needs to win.
They support Cressbeckler's stance on the issues?
They absolutely do. They feel they're even more antiquated and unhinged than McCain's.
Really?
Yeah, for instance, here's Cressbeckler on international trade.
All our jobs are going to China. Now, if I
Washington red tape by replacing Congress with a horse that stomps once for yes, twice for no.
Well, Jane, thanks for all the information. Now, we attempted to reach Joe Cressbedler for an interview, but when our reporters approached his campaign headquarters, he told them to get off his property and stick his hound dog on them.
We gotta turn things around here. We gotta make some changes. We shouldn't be teaching those calculators in school. We should be teaching our kids how to work. American's a man who relies on himself. Every time I go to Washington, I smell a rat, a fish, a donkey with vipers. Let's get out the car and say 1, 2, 3. And then when I'm president, we'll kill him. I ain't gonna be in no debate, but if John McClain wants to take me on the wood splitting contest, I can guarantee I can split a cord of wood quicker than he can.
There's several more, but I'll stop there. Now, I put a whole bunch of stuff on the table. Does anybody want to talk about anything? Yeah.
I was actually just watching Lincoln today.
Yeah.
And one thing I noticed in the movie was that there were a lot of times that he would just say the funniest things, but in his environment, people were like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
And especially the story about the Englishman in the water closet.
Yeah.
With the picture of George Washington, and so it was pretty accurate.
Yes, yeah. His sense of humor, most people, when they try to be funny, if they don't get a response, they kind of cool it. But Lincoln didn't. So for Lincoln, it was self-satisfying, and it kept him going. And if you know anything about his personal life, his wife was subject to the fits of depression, and Lincoln had problems, and he lost a son and stuff. So for him, it's what kept him going. And he didn't seem to need external reinforcement. When he did full-scale speeches to large audiences, he could use humor well there. It's much different at a cabinet meeting and, say, at a political rally. So there he got the good response. And he didn't have a great speaking voice. Yeah.
You were talking about, when you were talking about ridicule, you said that ridicule was not serious criticism. I was wondering about the relationship between humor and criticism, specifically the relationship between criticism and parody, caricature, sarcasm. Because, like, if someone parodies something, or someone caricatures something, which is kind of a visual parody,
Yeah.
you take a salient feature and you exaggerate it.
Right.
But that salient feature may not necessarily be anything bad. It's just something, whatever it is, teeth or
okay.
hair or no.
Okay, yeah.
And sometimes when you're parodying or caricaturing, you're doing it out of kindness, and you're doing it out of they're important enough to caricature or to parody.
Yeah.
And they have, like, a lot of Poe's poetry was parodied because his style was so, like, nobody else had that style.
Right.
So how much, when you have parody and caricature and satire, how critical is it, or how critical does it need to be?
That's a good point. When most people think of satire in connection with politics, they think of somebody trying to get votes at the expense of the guy that they're criticizing. So usually in politics, it's critical. But you're right, satire can be affectionate. Parody certainly can be affectionate. You think of, for example, somebody doing a parody of a movie or of a commercial or something, you could really admire it. And so, like with your friends, when you mimic a friend of yours for something that they do, it might be something negative, but it might just be the size of their ears, or it might be the way they walk or something. So, I agree completely that copying somebody and exaggerating their feature doesn't mean that you have to copy some fault. Now, I put up those three things, all of which were faults: physical, intellectual, and moral. So that's a really good corrective to what I said. That's really good.
Also in satire, you have two kinds of satire. One kind of satire is playful. The other kind of satire is bitter.
Right.
And I think in bitter, there's very little humor in the bitter satire.
Okay. All of these things shade into non-humor. If I get really angry enough at a president and I'm a satirist, I might just turn to just raising money to elect his opposition or something. It seems to me if you don't have any humor in it, then I wouldn't even call it satire anymore. I just call it outright criticism. So, yes?
Can you talk a little bit about humor as a sort of communal event?
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah.
Perfect. Because a lot of the humor that we get comes from reading, we tend to think of humor as some kind of relationship of a video I'm watching or a book that I'm reading in me. But humor is almost all, in real life, humor is almost always the laughter of a group. There's a book by Robert Provine called Laughter, and I forget his numbers. He worked with students at the University of Maryland. I think he said that you are something like 7 times less likely to laugh at the same stimulus if you're by yourself. And I know that's true for me. There are very few things that if I'm by myself, just really, really funny stuff. And all I need is one person there. So there's a theory of this, of why this happens, and it comes from anthropology. It's that laughter was originally what's called a play signal. And 6 million years ago, when gorillas, chimps, orangutans, and proto-humans were all the same species, apes played largely by mock aggression. And it's still true. If you ever see chimps or monkeys go after each other, they grab each other's arms, they pretend to bite. Tickling is a mock form of attack. So they needed a way to signal that they weren't really out to hurt the other one. And we still do this with children. I'm going to get you, on your belly and all this stuff. So laughter was a way, visually and sound-wise, of communicating that this is only play. And that's why, to this day, if you hear laughter, you tend to laugh even before you find out what's so funny. If you approach a group of people who are laughing, you don't have to have it explained to you. You just laugh because they're laughing. So I agree completely. Laughter is usually the laughter of a group, and it's so fast. The contagion of laughter is amazingly fast.
I was thinking specifically of these viral videos of where
Yes.
people just laughing, you have no idea what they're laughing about.
Yeah.
There's something about the laughter that somehow...
That's it. There have even been laughter epidemics. This one has been written up many times, but I haven't seen enough documentation on it. It was in what's now, it was Tanganyika at the time, but it's not Tanzania. It was a Catholic girls' high school where somebody started laughing and somebody else started laughing. And before long, they had to close that class, and then the laughter somehow got, and according to the legend, this was in 1963, 64. The girls went home and it spread to their mothers. For some reason, it was only picked up through the females. And some young women laughed so hard that they passed out from lack of oxygen. So that would be the ultimate extreme case. But the basic idea that laughter is social, completely right. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had a hypothesis about the relationship between humor in the media and political involvement of people, because I mean, throughout history there's been the political cartoon phenomenon, but now with the rise of technology, it's just such a huge part of campaigning, and everything is what people get from things like The Daily Show, or what people get from the Colbert Report or from The Onion. And I wondered if you thought that made people more motivated to learn actual political details, or if it has a distancing effect, like what you talked about at the beginning of the presentation.
That's a great question. I think that humor by itself doesn't motivate anybody to do anything. I think the basic form of humor is to enjoy some incongruity in a playful way, but not to be motivated. If after all you see a cartoon, you say, you know, that's right, there is a lot of political corruption in Washington, I should do something, I should write a letter to myself. Well, you're not laughing anymore. So it seems to me that laughter, the basic physical act of laughter, is one that's disabling. When you think about it, when you laugh really hard, you lose, for example, you lose total control of your upper body. So you couldn't do anything. You couldn't throw a rock, for example. If you laugh really hard, your legs collapse, you fall on the floor, and you wet your pants. So that's clearly not a motivated state. That's not a motivated state. I use this in my book, Comic Relief, to argue that humor isn't an emotion. Emotions are motivated states. So when I'm afraid, for example, I'm motivated to get out of here. When I'm angry, I'm motivated to overcome some obstacle. When I love something, I'm motivated to get close to it, protect it. But in laughter, I'm not motivated. So I think that I don't think that finding something, a politician funny, say on the Colbert Report or Jon Stewart, makes you go out and do anything. In fact, I think most people don't do anything. If you really want to motivate, I had a slide that I skipped by Cicero. Cicero said, people want to see actual criminals criticized with something heavier than jokes. If somebody's an actual criminal and we should stop them, then humor isn't the way to go. So I agree completely. On the other hand, once you put the idea in people's heads, that take Bill Maher, Rachel Maddow, and take what they did with George W. Bush. Just by making a president look stupid and incompetent, you raise critical questions. So you can prepare the way for action, but by itself, humor doesn't motivate people to do anything. Certainly not to the ramparts in some political cause. So that's a terrific question. And the other thing I'm sure you know, because it was right implicit in your question, is that among people 18 to 25, most of them get most of their political information from these fake news shows, which is itself kind of... There's a new book called The Stuart Colbert Effect. I'm reviewing it right now. It's by a small publisher in Canada. Other questions? Yes?
Just kind of a more personal. How often do you check the Onion? Or like if you know about a major world event, do you go to the Onion to see what they're...
I don't, but I should. I think it's by far the best. That Chris Beckley piece, there's a follow-up to that. Just the skill that guy, what it would take to put all those things together, and their use of words. So I find them the very best. But I don't use it to track things. Yes?
I have a comment just about presidential humor. You were talking about Calvin Coolidge and his being laconic.
Yes.
There was a story, I don't know if it's true or not, but a social climber sat next to him at a banquet and said she had heard about his reputation. She said, I bet I can get you to say more than 2 words. And he said, you lose. Follow up a little bit on that question or the comment that you made that when you talked about Obama, he talked about himself as a mutt.
Yeah.
I remember there were some responses to that actually weren't very humorous.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm curious about that potential signifying that goes on when we talk about language that moves from the literal to something else. Because in one sense, that was a moment that really wasn't, I mean, it was sort of humor, but it was this different level of communication, because here it was this person who was neither black nor white, but black and white, and is often the one that is less desirable. So can you talk a little bit about that nature of the humor that was perhaps self-deprecating, but also something else?
Yeah, I don't, I'm sorry.
Like a joke, but like, is it appropriate for us to laugh? Like he busts out a joke and everybody's like, can we like, is that okay?
Well, it wasn't like it was a Yo Mama joke.
Right, yeah. No.
And this, because the Yo Mama jokes aren't about people that we know when he's talking about himself, but when he uses that word mutt, though, that becomes sort of steeped in a kind of American history of American race relations.
You bet.
So I know some buzz that wasn't quite about the humor, and it was sort of like, well, why would he say that? And so I'm just curious if you could tease out a little bit more about that in terms of...
Let me start with a really general comment. Humor is dangerous because it can be taken so many ways. The ambiguity is